10 days left in this general election campaign, and we are beside ourselves with excitement as change seems inevitable and we prepare to welcome a Labour government. Well, not quite. Keir Starmer may be on course to win a healthy majority on the 4th of July, but expectations of what he and his colleagues will deliver is not particularly high. Will Labour deliver more than people are expecting? For Rishi Sunak, surely polling day can't come quickly enough. From his rain-drenched launch to his D-Day disaster and his Sky TV faux pas, he is now having to deal with a gambling scandal within his unmanageable party. Has there ever been a worse election campaign? And over the weekend, we sadly learnt of the passing of a Manchester legend. A few words from me this week about the great Sir Howard Bernstein. Welcome to the latest Downtown Den Politics podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, no Jim Hancock this week, but a more than able substitute in our man in the West Midlands, Kevin Johnson. And of course, as ever, during this election campaign, the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, Joe Phillips, me, Frank McKenna from Downtown in Business. And on Monday night, you guys kindly joined me for what I thought was a fascinating roundtable discussion about the election campaign down in London, about 30 of our members. Joe, you led the discussion with Joni Smith from the Tony Blair Institute, and thought she gave some sort of fascinating insights into the election, not just here in the UK, but internationally. She'd been involved in a number of election campaigns. Now, I think it's fair to say, Joe, that everybody around the table is anticipating a change, a Labour government, come the 5th of July. But there wasn't a massive amount of enthusiasm. And I would say underwhelming was probably the feeling that most people have as far as a new Labour government coming into power is concerned.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, Frank. I mean, I think, what Joni talked about and what I talked about as well for a little bit was the difference between the campaign with Tony Blair at the helm coming up to the 97 election and this one. And I think the country is exhausted. I mean, they're exhausted, partly because of the legacy of COVID, if you like, the cost of living challenges, and the endless pantomime of nothing getting done while the Tories navel gaze and, rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic as yet another leader comes through. I mean, anyone, and your members will know this very well, Frank, anyone in business, they've had nothing, no certainty whatsoever. And the post-Brexit thing, I mean, I think the other thing that came out quite interestingly on the discussion on Monday was the fact that nobody's talking about Brexit. And yet we all know it's had a huge impact. And I think there is a sense of inevitability, but I think you're absolutely right. There's no great enthusiasm. And I think that is the danger for Labour, that as we go into this last week, 10 days of campaigning, that either Labour supporters think, I don't need to bother, because they're going to win anyway. Something that I saw over the weekend that made me want to weep was that 1 in 4 young people between 18 and 34 aren't planning to vote. And you think, for goodness sake, it's your future. What are you planning to do then?
And then there's a complaint, of course, during almost every election campaign that political parties focus on older voters. Well, that's the inevitable consequence of low turnout amongst those younger voters. It's chicken and egg in a sense, isn't it? But Kevin, fascinating discussion, as I say, and I thought there was a point within the conversation where you pushed back a little on what many around the table were talking about, and that was the thing that Joe's referenced there, and Brexit, and this idea that, everybody is sort of having buyer's remorse now. What's your sort of sense of how the election campaign's going, how Labour have handled what, let's face it, is quite a a challenging time for them because they are expected to win. They're not coming from the position of underdog. And yet, if Keir Starmer does win, as we expect, in a couple of weeks' time, he will only be the fourth Labour Prime Minister that's ever been elected. So I would suggest that the caution is almost inevitable from any Labour campaign.
I think that's right. I do want to return to the apathy theme, but I'll come back to that. The first thing I'd say is, let's imagine he wins a majority of 200. Not impossible, I'm by no means certain, but I'm sure we'll come back to the latest polls. But if he were to go from an 80-seat loss in terms of majority in 2019 to 4.5 years later securing a 200-seat majority, that would be extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And as you say, there have not been that many changes in overall power in this country. We've had long-form governments, Thatcher, Blair Brown, and Thatcher and Major, Blair Brown, Cameron, and 74 other prime ministers who seem to have been in post over the last few years. So the change will be remarkable. The scale of change could be remarkable. And you've got to give him credit for that, because he's done that in a pretty sort of quiet way, really. I'm sure we'll get all kinds of other headlines about whether Corbyn wins in Islington and all the rest of it. But if he pulls off anything more than a win, and then certainly anything more than a 100-seat majority, absolutely extraordinary. Secondly, I'd say, maybe he's setting a low bar. Maybe if you set a low bar in terms of the excitement of the campaign and the ambition in the manifesto, etc., we can only improve on that, can't you? Whether that's part of the strategy, I don't know. But I don't think it's a bad idea to, after all the kind of Boris promises of 2019 and all the rest of it, and Liz Truss, etc., that he under-promises and over-delivers rather than the other way around. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. And I think the hope for me is that he will be a better Prime Minister than maybe he's been a performer as a leader of the opposition. We may talk about debates and all the rest of it. But a couple of interesting, an interview in The Guardian, or sort of profile, sort of fly on the wall type thing in The Guardian, I think on Saturday, an interview in the Sunday Times this weekend, which brings out his character a bit more, which he's just not been able to sort of translate, particularly in those leader debates where he's had opportunity. One little glimpse, I thought, in the four-way debate last week, but he's not really been able to bring his character out. And I think, maybe 3 months, 6 months into being PM, he might be able to do that. But I'm with, Joe on the young voter, etc., and apathy. The danger of running the Ming Vase campaign is that you've got an apathetic audience who will not come out to vote, or because people think there is an already preset majority of people won't come out, and the young people point that Joe makes. So all of that, I think, that could well be, people talk about, is this the immigration, is this the growth election? Could it be the apathetic election?
And turnout will be something I'm sure people, particularly the likes of Nigel Farage, will be pointing to and signalling that, actually it's plague on all your houses and you may have this big majority, but the voting system is corrupt, I think is the word that Farage will start throwing about very quickly, should Reform get the 1 or 2 seats that is being predicted. Let's just stick with the Labour Party for now. And an interesting comment that you made there, Kevin, in terms of, are they setting the bar low? So it's an overpromise and under-deliver has been the problem that we've had from the Conservative Party, certainly over the past 5 years. Maybe Labour is going in the opposite direction, Joe. And I think there's some low-hanging fruit for them, isn't there? Rachel Reeves can change the fiscal rules by which she makes her decisions. I think that would be a relatively simple thing for her to do. They will inevitably now, I think, see a fall in interest rates in August, and they'll get a bit of a feel-good factor from that. Who knows? England may win the European Championships, and Keir Starmer, I'm sure, will be in Berlin celebrating. If that happens to be, listen, that would be a bloody miracle, the way they're playing at the moment. But some things I think that Labour will do that may surprise people, and therefore give them more of a honeymoon period than perhaps people are suggesting at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Rachel Reeves, in an interview over the weekend, said, we can do things quite quickly. You'll be surprised at what we can do. And I think, Kevin's point about 4.5 years to turn the Labour Party round to within, snatching distance is astonishing. And if you put that in business terms, for somebody to have taken on a failing business, with Jeremy Corbyn running it and all the factions and everything else that was just going on at the time, that is astonishing. And we've talked before about people staying in opposition, doing the hard yards, sticking at it, public service, dedication, wanting change. The other thing I think that both you and I have spoken and written about, Frank, is something that I think it's sort of insidious, but I think it will permeate to the general public, and it's a change of tone. Yeah. And I think instead of the screaming headlines about trans this or net zero or, whatever it is that the Daily Mail and the Express want to get the blood pressure up about, that will stop. I mean, what are the right-wing press are going to find something to attack the Labour government on if we have a Labour government. There's no doubt about that. But this screaming, ranting, I think will stop. And actually, I think that will lower the temperature and people will begin to have conversations about, let's have a look at a really interesting report out over the weekend about urban planning and about building in town centres, which is what Labour are really keen on. So you build where you've got the transport links, you've got the infrastructure, instead of doing what's happened over the last 10, 15 years, which is, I know, there's a field, let's go and build on it, and let's believe what the developers say about building a school and a GP surgery and affordable homes. So I think those things will happen quite quickly, and you two will know far better than me, but I think it will also permeate through to local authorities who will feel that they can have a conversation. And if you begin to see changes on really big but unsexy stuff like social care and special needs schools and those things that really affect people in such a huge way, I think we will, within a year, within 18 months, I think we could be living in a very different country.
Changing the discourse of debate in this country would certainly be an achievement in my view. And I think that for the first time in a long time, Kevin, and I include Tony Blair's government in this, I don't think we're going to have a prime minister that is dictated to by newspaper headlines. I think he's got a strategy. He'll set his stall out. He'll have things that he wants to deliver. I think the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, she will be in July, I think. Again, somebody who's very steady, has a plan, wants to deliver. That might help politics in this country and may, to your point, actually start to address some of this apathy, because part of that surely comes from the fact that people have been overpromised in recent times and they are just totally fed up with the lack of progress that's been made over the past decade and a half, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the moving away from a politics which is governed by division is going to be very important, which I suppose is characterised and kicked off in particular by Brexit and everything that's followed, cultural identity issues and net zero and all the rest of it. And I think, let's assume we've got a Tory party which is down to maybe between 100 and 150 seats, probably with a Farage and one or two other reforms in their house, I would imagine, but really a very belittled Tory party, which is going to turn in on itself, of course, to work out where it's going, which sort of direction it's going to go in. So they're off the books, aren't they, for a year or two while they sort themselves out and whatever happens with Farage. So they've got a bit of a free rein in that sense. I don't mean all this nonsense about super majorities and there being no democratic accountability. We might return to that. So they've got some room. They don't need to be going around finding things to batter the Tories with, because they've done that for themselves and they've got to sort themselves out. I assume he's got up his sleeve, not necessarily some of the big things like Bank of England independence, but I assume he's got some 100 days type little tokens of things that people can hang on to, some symbols. I think also in the sort of Rachel Reeves arena that you've both touched on, one would assume because of the work she's done and other ministers, shadow ministers have done in the city and around business, that they've got some investment to unlock, that people are going to sort of throw some money in the pot at whatever it might happen to be, including GB energy and related matters. And the point I made last week, Frank, is the 3 C's. What we need, I think, next out of the government is competence, culture and communication, a different way of governing, a different way of communicating, a different way of being, including with opposition, even Nigel Farage and John Swinney and whoever else. We need a bit of the 3 C's. Starmer uses quite a good line, I think, which is about politics should touch a bit less lightly on people's lives. Now, I'm against that because I love the drama of politics, as do both of you probably. But broadly speaking, he's right, isn't it? People just want the government to get on and do what a government should. They may have left and right views about the size of the state, etc. But broadly speaking, they just want to get on and at least deliver the fundamentals and not have, blazing headlines and rows every night over social media, Daily Mail, Express, etc., as Joe mentioned. Politics touching a bit less lightly on other people's lives, while we can still keep very heavily in touch with it, would be no bad thing for the country overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that, Kevin. I think that, there's never been a time, has there, more turbulent time when almost every day it's politics that is leading every news outlet. And that, may feel normal to people now, but it certainly wasn't the case pre-Brexit, if I can put it that way. Joe, the reason we're talking about a Labour government in the short terms that we are is these poll numbers and the tracker, which Sky produce on a daily basis, is now showing Labour 21 points ahead in the polls. Labour staffers are tearing their hair out for the very reason you said. This gives people an excuse perhaps to just sit at home and think, well, job done, Labour are going to win anyway, we're getting change. Why should I bother going to the polling station? Do you think that those polls are in any way, shape or form inaccurate, or do you think they're sort of basically sense checking where the country is?
I think they are a snapshot, and I think they are a barometer at any given stage in the campaign. They are more used to the parties than they are to the general public because, well, two things. One is an awful lot of people will have made up their minds who they're going to vote for, whether they're going to be tactical because they want to get rid of the incumbent MP or because they're in love with somebody else who's standing. But there is a huge, and I think this is quite unprecedented because they're sort of around about 45% undecided. Now, those are the people that actually all parties are trying to get hold of. Now, they may go, I don't know, I can't make my mind up. Oh, sod it, I'll just go to the pub and I'll forget to vote. There's those. But, in the past, we've seen all the focus on the swing seats, the marginal seats. Now, this election is different because everything is up for grabs and you've got reform, which is the new kid, old wolf in sheep's clothing or old wolf in old wolf's clothing on the block this time. And they are having an impact, certainly on the opinion polls. And the interesting piece by Peter Kellner from YouGov in the Sunday Times yesterday, talking about if the reform vote, if the Tories manage to claw back 2/3 of the people who say they're going to vote for reform, Tory MPs would save their seats. It could potentially reduce Labour's majority to just 18. Now that, gives the Tories something to think for, because I think we discussed it last week. Why aren't the Tories attacking reform far more instead of attacking Labour to try and claw back their core support, if you like? And the other thing is that, whether or not you think it's true, it is also a reminder to Labour that they can't be complacent. That actually that fissure, if you like, of the right could have a huge impact on the overall thing. So the long answer is, yes, the polls are important, but they are not going to tell us anything that we won't really know until the 5th of July.
It's interesting, actually. I think partly because of the poor content within the campaign, if I can put it that way. The polls are setting the agenda in a sense, Kevin. So we are learning, or talking about, I should say, things like supermajorities and how big will this Labour majority be. And that, as I say, I think is being dictated because the polls actually the only thing that interesting happening through the campaign. Part of that, again, to be fair to the Labour Party, is that how often can you say, well, we're going to put VAT on schools, but we're not going to tax anybody who's a working person? How often can you say we're going to reform the NHS? We're not necessarily going to throw more. It's a 6-week campaign. It's a long space to fill. And therefore, the media now are leading a lot of their news programmes with the latest poll says. And as I say, this terminology supermajority has emerged, which I first heard from Grant Shapps, I'm not sure whether he made the words up, but he's good at making names up for himself, and maybe he came up with the supermajority word as well. Is it going to be a supermajority, Kevin?
Well, of course, first off, there is no such thing as a supermajority in the way our electoral system works. You know, it's an American term from other democracies where they have a different kind of electoral system. So, and I don't think anybody really believes today, if you allow the Labour in to have 200 rather than 150 majority or whatever, that's going to make any material difference to things. One would hope, I'm sure they'll track back a little bit, but I would hope that the Labour Party will be good to some of the constitutional and devolution type reforms they've promised, not least in House of Lords and beyond, and obviously as we're all interested in more power to regional mayors. So it doesn't really hold much truck, and I think Labour's got to work very hard with it. You know, if you want change, you've got to vote for it. You know, a sense that it's not a done deal. You may not be excited by Keir Starmer or whoever else, or you may think we should be a bit more ambitious, but please vote for us, because change may not happen if you don't vote for it. I think there's also something, I think this was true in the Blair 97 win, that they tried to project that, you know, be part of the win, not just make the win, make the change, but actually if we get on the other side, the Labour Party, if we get on the other side and we make some decent fist of government, they won't get everything right, of course they won't, but if they make a decent fist of government, then people will feel better that they voted for it, and they saw off those terrible Tories and maybe give the Tories some time to re-engineer themselves and come back, you know, stronger in a sort of Cameron type way or a Thatcher type way or whatever. So I think, but overall, I would say the campaign is not the friend of the Labour Party, because it is so long, because they've got relatively little new and exciting to say. That's their strategy. Because they've got very little new and exciting to say, it's going on a bit long. But even I am kind of thinking, get me to the 4th of July. I just want to cast my vote and sit in front of, you know, Laura Kuenssberg and Clive Murray. You know, let's get to the exit poll now. Never mind, these are the polls. Having said that, Labour is helped rather by D-Day, gambling gate, you know, a drip of an announcement, you know, all the rest of the gaffes that have befallen the Tories. So they're getting away with it. But in normal circumstances, this 6-week campaign would be a bit too long for Labour, and you know, and the supermajority allegedly would be tracked back a bit more. But because of the way the kind of gaffes the Tories have had, and because of the incision of Farage, they're probably okay, not going to suffer too much from the long campaign.
And the final point on this before we take a short break, Joe, the Liberal Democrats' strategy appears to be working. So Ed Davey's got himself a profile. We were laughing in week one. I remember saying, you know, Ed Davey found himself falling in the shit. Well, all these photo opportunities that have captured the attention of the media, and in a campaign that's been as poor in terms of its content, then of course he's been helped as far as that's concerned. But more importantly, I suppose, from their perspective, Lib Dem's perspective, is that they've really targeted the resources on those blue wall seats where they think they've got a chance. And it looks as if it's going to pay dividends for them. Some polls suggesting they may creep into the north of 50 seats, Joe.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've had to come back from an awfully long way down. But their strategy has been good. And if you take away the sort of stunts that Ed Davey's done, which has got, as we've said before, you know, masses and masses of coverage in terms of photographs. And a photograph is great. You get a photograph of a party leader on the front page, falling in the shitty waters of Windermere or sliding down a slide. That's better than, and the Liberal Democrats have produced another policy document. But the thing that they have done really, really well, they've focused on two very key issues, and they've stuck at it: social care, which they have been leading the pack on. That's partly because of Ed's personal experience of looking after his very disabled son and looking after his mum. And also they have really focused on sewage and effluent in the rivers and seas, which are really important matters. And, you know, they've been really sensible by concentrating on two very clear areas. It will have helped them recruit more people on the ground. They did quite well in the local elections, so they're beginning to build that base. And as I said on Monday when we had dinner, you know, Liberal Democrat campaigners always say once you get the Lib Dems on the ground, it's like dog poo on the pavement. They're very hard to get rid of.
Yeah.
Frank, can I just add two things from a communication perspective? I mean, Joe's absolutely right about everything there, but two things from a communication perspective. Party election broadcast, they've had the best one. Ed with his son that Joe touched on, which I mean, I've seen Labour politicians, not sure about Tories, I've seen Labour politicians retweet it and comment on it and how, moving and touching it was. And I thought he had the best performance in the question time debate last week. Yeah. I mean, not a free run by any means. He got his flack and so on, but I thought he came across probably as the most human, the most humble. But he had points to make, and he dealt with, including on the stuff about why you're going down a slide, etc. This is a serious election campaign. He answered all of that pretty well, I thought. He's had a good campaign.
Yeah, I think he's done well. And again, listen, expectations weren't massive. So low bar as far as that's concerned. But you can only play with the cards you dealt with, and the Liberal Democrats, I think, have played there as well. Listen, we're going to talk about a campaign that's not gone so well after the break, and that's the Tory campaign. And ask whether Rishi Sunak wishes he'd got on a plane to Rwanda himself rather than face what he's faced over the past 6 weeks. So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Hi, this is Frank McKenna, the Chief Exec and Group Chair of Downtown in Business. I'm delighted to announce that in association with the Northern Power Towns organisation, we're organising a very special conference, Birchwood in Warrington, on Friday the 12th of July, looking at that very subject, focusing on Northern Power Towns, how we get our towns economically growing, how our towns can contribute to UK PLC. There'll be about 20 local authority executives in the room. We've got private sector partners from across the north of the country coming into the room and contributing too. So if you want to be with us for that conference, it's free to attend. Go to our website, that's all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, to the events section and have a look at that Northern Power Towns Conference, 12th of July, Warrington, and register your place today. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Delighted this week to be joined by our man in the West Midlands, Kevin Johnson, and Joe Phillips. And we've been talking about the Labour Party, what it might deliver in government should it be elected on July the 4th. But it's been an absolutely disastrous campaign for Rishi Sunak, from his rain-drenched launch on the steps of Downing Street 5 weeks ago, D-Day, his story about not having Sky Television being the worst thing that happened to him as a child. God love him. And then, of course, over the past couple of weeks, Gamblegate, as some people are calling it. And this is Conservative staffers and candidates betting on the date of the election a couple of days before he officially announced it. The thing that surprised me, Kevin, I think I said this to you on Monday night, I've mentioned this to a few scousers, this PPS of Sunak going out and putting £100 down on the election date being the 4th of July. And the reaction was, what a stupid bugger. Why did he only put £100 on if he knew it was an absolute sure thing? So that aside, it's been a disastrous campaign, Kevin. And as somebody who is an expert and an advisor in communications, have you ever seen a worse election campaign?
Well, one is tempted to say Theresa May 2017. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. I mean, that was pretty poor strategically and in terms of delivery, not least on the social care policy. So, I mean, they rival each other, don't they, in that way? Rishi Sunak, is he a better campaigner? I don't know. At the beginning of the campaign, things will only get wetter beside and all of that. And, you know, are you looking forward to the Euros, Welsh fans? Beyond those couple of things, actually, they did come out with policies. They did have ideas. And, you know, we can talk about national service and all the rest of it. But, you know, you did think, hello, they've got some things in the locker here, whether you like them or not. They did seem to be ready for a campaign in that sense, having a sort of manifesto sort of ready to go. But they've had all the gaffes. He's not a great campaigner overall, is he? He's not natural with people. I think Keir, from what you see beyond the kind of stage stuff,
Joe, have you seen anything quite like it? I think I referenced the 1983 election. Last Monday in London. I did say I was 10 at the time when I was knocking on doors in the new town of Skelmersdale, where I grew up, and Skelmersdale would have been seen as a very natural, Labour supporting town. I was knocking on doors in 83 and people were laughing at me, so as if I'm going to vote for that lot. You had Michael Foot as leader, you had this policy of withdrawing from the European Union. Who would be as mad? It was the EEC. And we had unilateral nuclear disarmament. I mean, these were all reasons that working class people in Skem were giving me for not voting Labour, and that was a disastrous campaign. Halfway through, Jim Mortimer, who was the General Secretary at the time, did a press conference and without any questions from the media said, "Oh, by the way, we've just had a meeting and we've decided Michael Foot is still the leader." Just bizarre. And we almost had that with Sunak a couple of weeks ago. People were talking about him resigning after that D-Day disaster. Things haven't got much better for him. And this Gamblegate thing is something that cuts through because people can understand that. Sometimes I think we get very excited about mistakes and errors that ministers or MPs make. But it's these sort of things, it's having a party when everybody else is locked down. It's putting a bet on when you've got insider information. They're the sort of things that really piss people off. And as I say, it's cut through, Joe, and it's not going away.
No, and it comes down to trust. Frankly, Rishi Sunak, apart from the fact that he is wooden, we know he's fabulously wealthy. Well, Michael Heseltine was fabulously wealthy, but he connected with people. There are lots of people who are fabulously wealthy. It's not their fault, but you can still be a human being. What Sunak hasn't got is any empathy at all, which actually Keir Starmer and Ed Davey particularly have got, and Nigel Farage can certainly confect it. He hasn't got any empathy. The campaign has been a disaster. And, this whole thing about the gambling, on the scale of things, it's not a big deal. But what it sends through is yet another message that they don't think the rules apply to them. They don't think it matters because we're just little people. And when you put that in the context of, as you just touched on there, Frank, Partygate, which people still feel absolutely bloody livid about, I've got a son who's a paramedic. If I saw Boris Johnson in the street, I'd punch him in the face for that, for the fear that my son would never come home from work. It's just appalling. And I think that cuts through to lots and lots of people. I think the other thing, maybe not quite in such a big scale, but it ought to, is the amount of money that has been wasted. And Best for Britain did some figures a couple of weeks ago. It's £130 billion since 2019. So where was Rishi Sunak then? Remind me, what was he doing? That is an awful lot of public money that could have funded all the things that we need. And it's this disregard, jobs for the boys, contracts for your mates, we'll get away with it. And Rishi Sunak is weak. You know, he hasn't sacked these people. He hasn't got rid of these people. And you've now got people like Tobias Ellwood, you know, a very sensible, very thoughtful Tory, saying this is ridiculous. You know, where's his leadership? I mean, I feel sorry for party activists because we've all been there. It's bloody hard work going out and knocking on doors. When you're knocking on doors and people just are slamming the door in your face, not because of what you've done, but because of what other people have done. It's awful. And it's a terrible shame for the Conservative Party. But they need time in opposition. They need to work out where they want to be.
Frank, can I just add on Gamblegate? Because I think almost picking up some of the threads of what Joe's saying there, almost what's worse about Gamblegate, and the same applies to Partygate, is I don't think they thought they were getting away with it. What makes it worse is they probably didn't really think it was anything wrong. Yeah. They were having their Friday night drinks, having their leaving drinks in Partygate. These guys, 3 of them, 4 of them, however many more will re-emerge today and beyond. They probably didn't even think it was anything wrong. And in a way, that makes it worse because the culture is all wrong. Yes. I mean, as Joe says, a figure I think we all admire, Michael Heseltine, he just wouldn't countenance such a thing happening. He wouldn't allow that culture to kind of develop. And to be fair to her, I don't think Theresa May would allow such a culture to pervade itself through a number 10 operation. What makes it worse is they didn't even know. They didn't even think they were doing anything wrong. Never mind whether they thought the cosmetics of it wouldn't play well if it got onto the front page of the Daily Mail or wherever else. Makes it even worse, I think.
Yeah, it is incredible. Yet another scandal right in the middle of the campaign. What surprised me, though, is this lack of action from Sunak, not suspending anyone. Now, you can get away to an extent with saying, well, these people haven't yet been investigated thoroughly and they may come out of this, you know, sort of innocent until proven guilty. But his PPS immediately admitted. He said, look, I've cocked up, I've put a flutter on.
Yeah.
Sorry, you know. Suspend him. You know, his name's on the ballot paper. He can continue to campaign. It's not that big a deal, actually. But Sunak failing to act, I think, just leans into this idea that people already have of him, that he's weak, that he's not in control of his party, in fact, that his party is unmanageable. And that ultimately, I think, will cost him an awful lot of support on the 4th of July. Because even if you think, well, Keir Starmer might not be the most charismatic and exciting, the Labour Party might not be changing things in as dramatic a way and as radical a way as we'd like to see. What they do feel, I think, from Starmer is somebody who's got integrity, somebody who is certainly in charge of his party, and somebody, as you referenced this earlier, Kevin, I think it's really important, will change the culture of the politics in this country, which is hugely important. Whoever is advising Sunak, you know, I did say, you know, he shouldn't have needed advice as far as D-Day was concerned, but somebody should have been sat down with him last week saying, look, Rishi, you've just got to suspend these people. I think his fear is we don't know whether all those genies are out the bottle yet as far as this Gamblegate situation is concerned. Are the higher profile people to emerge? And that's where I guess he's worried he might have got himself into a bit of a cleft stick.
Yeah, I mean, Frank, I was just going to say that what I've been surprised at from a media point of view, less surprised at, but this is the advice I give to Starmer, is to ask him who knew. Because the flurry of bets seemed to happen on the 21st of May, the day before, and then they ended on the 22nd when he called the election. And that's what's driving a lot of the inquiry. So the Gambling Commission have been asked by Labour, you know, can you publicly name all the people under, inspection, as it were, and under investigation? Well, I think the question to Starmer is, right, OK, who knew? Who in number 10, who in CCHQ knew you were calling an election? Because these things you keep fairly tight to a tight circle. So say it's down to 20 people or something like that. Who are they? And then let's see if any of these upstanding people have put a bet on. I think that would almost be the better way round. And if I was Sunak, I'd be thinking, OK, let's just come out. from some of the Tim Shipman and others, I think, have said that he had the decision made about 2 weeks before the 22nd of May. So in that 2-week period, who knew? Who at number 10, who at CCHQ was lining up stuff ready to go and making all the necessary arrangements? And let's do the inquiry that way around.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think Kevin is absolutely right. It's the sense of they don't think there's anything wrong. You know, you shouldn't have to spell it out to grown-ups who go into public service. And I know we're going to talk about Howard Bernstein in a little while, but, you know, when you talk about public service, it means being absolutely squeaky clean. And if you make a mistake, you fess up. This isn't a mistake. It's something that, I mean, would these people behave like this if they were working for a bank? Or, you know, that it's insider trading and they know they'd get sacked. Would they do this if they were working for a pharmaceutical company, you know, and they were giving share advice and all that sort of stuff? You know, would they do this if they were health professionals? I'll get you a prescription, don't you worry, I don't need to do it the normal way. It's this absolute flagrant disregard for, it's not even the rules, it's what Kevin says, it's not understanding what's right and what's wrong. They're the sort of people who park in a disabled parking bay and say, I'm only going to be here a couple of minutes.
Yeah. No, as I go back to the overall point where I think it's been an absolutely disastrous campaign. I'm sure that one of the reasons as well that Labour have continued with their Ming vase strategy is they're looking across the way and thinking, well, we don't really have to do much because they keep smashing any vase that's given to them. It's just been, as I say, one thing after another. And some of the things that have happened, we haven't even touched upon. And some of the photo opportunities, you know, Joe, you've talked about this. You know, the most basic of things, the Titanic, the exit sign over the head, trying to get the Prime Minister to feed sheep, which was the latest one last. And the funniest thing about that, I don't know if you saw, I can't remember which news channel it was on. It was a marvellous piece because you saw Cameron sort of slowly moving away out of shot, thinking this is going to be a bloody shit show. And there's Sunak looking as though all these sheep are running away from him. Well, you know, it's just incredible to me that let's remind ourselves, the most successful political party on the planet has ran such an atrocious, awful campaign. I am gobsmacked by it. And I would say, Kevin, I think it is worse than 2017. I think Theresa May made that one big mistake and she paid a heavy price for it. But it wasn't consistent. It wasn't as if every day she'd wake up and think, oh, you know, what can I do today that's going to fuck things up? And it really does seem to me as though, you know, I've been joking with Labour staffers saying, have some of you been seconded into the Tory campaign? Because it's been that bad. And as I say, I vaguely remember the 83 election. Obviously, I was just a foot soldier then. But that was bad. But this, I think, has just been atrocious. And the big surprise, Joe, these usually... you know, remember Saatchi and Saatchi, don't we? And the posters and the tax bombshell and Labour isn't working. All these great sort of headline-grabbing campaigns that they've had over the years. It seems to me that he's not surprised anyone more than he's surprised his own people in calling this election.
Well, apart from the people, as Kevin said, the ones who knew about it, and they should be easy to find. I mean, there's a couple of things there. I think we shouldn't forget that Labour have had a couple of missteps. You know, they didn't fight back on the £2,000 tax lie. Keir Starmer let that go in that first early debate. The embrace of Natalie Elphicke, the right-wing former Tory MP for Dover, was bizarre, absolutely bonkers, and completely unfathomable, particularly followed by what's happening with Diane Abbott, who's been suspended, you know. So Labour have those things they have faded into insignificance compared to the appalling disasters of the Conservative Party. And, you know, as you say, I think what we should do, we should make a careful note, and Downtown in Business should be tasked with this, to watch out where all these people end up, because you bet your life they'll end up as chief executives, non-executive directors, communications experts. And we need to go, hang on a minute, you are shit in government. How do you get into the real world?
Yeah. And a communications expert would be the last job I'd be given to any of them following this campaign. As I say, I think it's been awful. Listen, the final thing I want to talk about in terms of the general election campaign is these debates. We've talked about the question time gathering last week, which I think was probably the best of what's not been particularly exhilarating television. But I'm getting very frustrated. I don't know whether it's just because of my age and whether I've sat through too many of these things. But even the Koonsberg show yesterday, she asks Bridget Phillipson a question about trans. Bridget answers it. She pushes it again. She gets the same answer to the same question 3 times. And it's interminable if you're a viewer. Do interviewers these, you're from the media background, both of you. What are they thinking, Kevin? What are they trying to do to our politicians? Are they trying to make them look shifty? Are they trying to get them to say things that are going to embarrass them? Don't viewers actually, and one of the reasons we're not engaging with the voters, simply want politicians to be given some space to say these are the sort of things that we'd like to do?
We're not in a good state with it, are we? I mean, I think all from the sort of soundbite culture through, then the reaction to that was, Alistair Campbell, a man who I think is a great communication strategist, but that, his sort of strategy then of dealing with that message discipline has sort of come through with the right 24-hour news, social media, etc. All these kind of cycles of what's happened in media and communication are partly responsible for where we've got to, I think. And I don't think we've really worked out where to be with it. It's notable, of course, is it a TV or a play, I can't remember, that's coming up, which is looking at the relationship between Brian Warden and Margaret Thatcher, which holds back to a time when, we had 1 hour interviews over Sunday lunchtime. Even as when I was 10, Frank, I was watching, On the Record and Weekend World and all these kind of things, and you saw long form interviews. Well, we don't have that, and we can probably understand why that's the case. And we're only getting half an hour, for example, with Nick Robinson, although that's unpacking some useful stuff. And I think alongside that, to touch on the whole Ming Vase thing and lack of ambition, we've got really, really, really massive things to deal with in this country and indeed in the world. Just to pick 3 at random: climate, AI, and security. And we haven't had any sort of big debates about that. We're using climate as some kind of cultural or identity type issue about whether you're really for net zero or not. I mean, really, it's balmy. The good and bad that will come from AI. What's happening in wars already, but the kind of the fears around China, North Korea, Iran, etc. I mean, there really, really are some big issues and all kinds of advances, and we know about Broken Britain, public services, etc. We haven't had a campaign which has been about those big things. Hasn't been a kind of grown-up debate where you're not looking to point score. Go to your question, Frank. You're not getting interviewers are trying to find the thing that's going to then lead the news on the same channel and the other channels for the rest of the day. That's going to be great for clips on social media. We're somehow between the political class and the media class, and there might be an opportunity over the next 2 years if Keir does win big to almost kind of resettle some things and have a better way of doing politics and a better way of doing debates. That doesn't mean it's all about one-upmanship. It's not all about wedge issues. It's not all about clippable stuff. It's probably a bit of a forlorn hope, but if there was one thing I would be doing in a sort of comms role in the next government, would be trying to get to a position where we can have a sort of a better climate for big debates and the big kind of discussions that need to be had, which is not all about on which side you are or who's going to get more points off the back of that interview. It's a hope.
And one of the things that Starmer said during that question time debate, I don't think he was brilliant. I think he was okay. I think I agree with you, Kevin. I thought Ed Davey performed best of the 4 leaders. Sunak just looked as though he wants to be somewhere else, didn't he, really? But the one thing Starmer said that I thought was good was when he was asked the trans question, actually.
Yes.
And he sort of eventually got to the answer that he should have been given for the past 3 or 4 years when this thing has been raised in this very aggressive way, is we've got to be kinder. We've just got to have a conversation about issues such as this that are sensitive, that are not weaponized in the way that they have been. And what I want to do, he said, as Prime Minister, is be consensual. And I think he used the same term when he was asked about a potential supermajority. But Joe, overall, as I say, I think the television coverage, the interviews that I've seen, I've not been terribly impressed by, I'm afraid.
No, and I think TV executives will be having a look not just at the viewing figures, but at the general response. I mean, they're dreadful. They're boring television. It's hard to make it work. It's funny you should mention Brian Walden, who I used to work with about 100 years ago. But actually, you know, it's almost like we need the Brian Waldens, you know, Andrew Neil or Adam Bolton, somebody who's going to do that long form interview. I think the other thing is that it goes back to what we were saying and what Kevin's just said as well. You know, he and I are partly responsible. We train people how to do this. You know, we train them how to rebut the questions. We train them how to come up with a soundbite. We train them. Obviously, neither of us have touched the Conservative Party, but we might have done if we were working for the other side. But, you know, you train people to do that, knowing how the news cycle works. But if we go back to the very beginning of this conversation, where we talked about a cultural change, if people stop getting so furious about absolutely everything, then you actually begin to have conversations, and then people begin to listen. And it may well be that Keir Starmer's desire for, you know, a more consensual, or at least, you know, to disagree agreeably instead of threatening, might get us to a point where we're willing to listen. And at that point, you know, media changes. I think the other thing to say is, you know, we don't have local papers like we used to. Local radio's on its knees. We don't have Whitehall or specialist correspondents anymore. So everything gets lumped in together into that sort of basket of politics. Whereas once upon a time, you'd have had a transport correspondent. You know, how many industrial editors are there? I used to be an industrial editor. I think there's only one left for the Morning Star. You know, but in the old days, you'd have those specialist journalists who were talking about those issues for their audience. Now it's all an amorphous blob, and what gets on X is what gets coverage.
Yeah.
I don't know, Frank, and one
Sorry,
little thing. Quick bit of advice. I mean, I'm sure he's listening to Keir. Is here's some phrases to use when you're in number 10 and not be afraid of them. When you're asked a question, I don't care. I don't know. I'll be honest, I've not worked out the answer to that, or I just can't. Yeah. I don't know. I'm going to ask some clever people to try and, you know, help me form a view. And I got that wrong. Sorry about that. Yeah. I'm trying to make the best of it. Yeah. I mean, a bit more humility. I'm not saying, I'm not attacking Keir's character as a general point about politicians. They can't know the answer to everything. On big things around climate and AI and goodness knows what else, of course they don't know the answer to all these things. Just be a bit more honest and open. And I think, you know, you talk about the TV interviews. The thing that really riles me, I think, and Joe touched on it earlier, is these kind of splash headlines in the likes of the Daily Mail, and I think the Express is even worse, and of course on social media. But it's always about, come on, what, you know, I think you used the phrase earlier, Frank, what we're going to try and get the audience, the electorate, furious about. Let's just try and find a way not to make people furious and get people to try and understand that, by the way, in politics, in government, you have to make choices. That's what government is about, and things are complicated.
Yes, and I think we need to get back to that sort of, as I said earlier, really, you know, that discourse of conversation where we can have those mature debates without all wanting to kill one another. So hopefully, you know, if nothing else, a Labour government can bring some civility back into debate and discussion in this country. Right, I want to finish the programme today just by talking about Sir Howard Bernstein. I mentioned at the top of the show, sadly, Howard passed away after relatively short illness over the past 12 months or so. I guess he's not been too well. And listen, Sir Howard will go down as, if not the greatest chief executive in the history of local government, certainly one of them. He's transformed Manchester into the powerhouse that you see today over a long career. He started his career actually as an apprentice, I think it was, in Manchester City Council, worked his way up to chief executive. As I say, absolutely transformed the city. From our perspective, downtown and business, a hugely influential figure, because I went to see him about 15 years ago to ask him about his connections in Yorkshire. Actually, we were thinking about setting up in Leeds, And he said, why the bloody hell do you want to go to Leeds? Set up here. And I sort of said, well, Scouts are leading a big business organisation in Manchester. Some good business groups there at the time. Chamber of Commerce was very strong, Institute of Directors, pro-Manchester. And he said to me, look, he said, what downtown does is it brings different people into the room. Brings different people together. And I think you should come here because we need to shake things up a bit. And he then sort of immediately phoned Chris Oglesby up from Bruntwood, put us in touch. Bruntwood have been great friends of ours ever since, great supporters. And then he did our launch event for us at the Hilton Hotel in Manchester and attracted obviously a huge audience, about 200 people. The rest, as they say, is history. When people say to me, what's the difference between Manchester and other cities? Everywhere we go, people say, can you get Bernstein to come and talk to us? I always say confidence, because when downtown launched in my hometown of Liverpool, the city council spent the first year trying to close us down. They were phoning businesses saying, why are you joining that lot of bloody renegades? They were speaking to the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, David Wade Smith, saying, what can we do to get rid of these people? They saw us as a threat, whereas Howard saw people who were disruptors as good news, as people that should be engaged with, as people who could bring fresh ideas. And as long as you were constructive in any criticism that you had, he would be more than happy to bring you into the tent. And of course, what you end up doing when you've got people like that who are supporting you and working alongside you is you end up being their cheerleaders. And that's why they built this huge team Manchester, which a Scouser like me is part of. And Sir Howard Bernstein, his leadership, is, I think, the single reason why Manchester has been transformed and regenerated in the way it has. And he would be the first to say, I'm sure, a great team of people around him, not least his partnership with the leader for many years, Sir Richard Leese, as well. But he leaves an incredible legacy. In the introduction to the podcast today, there is a podcast we did with Sir Howard, a link to that, during the lockdown. And you will note, I think, his determination not to look back and talk about what he'd achieved, but to look forward, to look to the future. And also a link to a short tribute that I wrote on LinkedIn over the weekend as well. But we will miss him greatly. He was not just a great friend and supporter to our business, but a mentor, an advisor, a great friend to me. And very, very sad news. I know, Kevin, you will not be unaware of the influence that Howard has had on local government right across the country, in Manchester, of course, in particular.
Well, indeed, and I think thanks to you, Frank, I met him a couple of times, did a couple of events with him, and he was great company and with fantastic insight. So I feel for your loss and loss of colleagues in Manchester in particular. I mean, three things I'd say. One is, here we are talking about a great figure of local government. I mean, there's not many conversations go on about great figures in local government. So let's have one hope, if Labour get across the line, that there will be a different relationship with local government. I mean, they're not going to get wheelbarrows full of money from the government overnight, as one of your guests on Monday night was saying. But I think hopefully there is a more grown-up relationship with local government across the election, on the other side of the election. Secondly, of course, that the person who succeeded him in Manchester is now coming to Birmingham. Birmingham, not known for having highly successful local government chief execs in the last few years. They've had their challenges. So, and I know Joanne's very highly thought of, and not least because of the inheritance she got from Sir Howard. So I know I and many other people are looking forward to her taking up her reins in Birmingham. So that's fantastic. And the other thing I'd say is that, of course, where Howard and Sir Richard and colleagues prospered was out of challenges and opportunities. You know, the challenge, for example, and challenge underplays it, but the challenge of the aftermath of the IRA bomb, what went on there, the literal rebuilding, but working in partnership to rebuild the city centre, and the opportunities of things like the Commonwealth Games and what that's turned into. And apparently there's a small and somewhat successful football team that's arisen at that particular opportunity. So, he has many legacy points, but let's hope that his legacy also runs over both into the next government and its relationship with a more grown-up relationship with local government, and to a degree, inherited his legacy should do some good to Birmingham.
Joe?
Well, all I would say is that people who are standing for election or hoping to be part of the next administration in whatever role should read his obituaries, which are in everything from the FT to the Manchester News. You know, they're on everything, with comments from people as bizarre as Gary Neville and, you know, people like yourselves and people all over the place who were touched and inspired. But read those obituaries, because that tells you what public service is about, and that's what politics should be about.
Absolutely. And on that note, we will end this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. The truly great man, Sir Howard Bernstein, will certainly be missed by all those who knew him and many who didn't. We'll be back next week. We'll look at the next 7 days ahead. There is another one of those television debates, would you believe? But it looks as though we are heading for, absolutely. Jen, for those who are listening rather than watching this, Joe's just yawned. And next week we'll be just days away, of course, from polling day. We'll see if those polls shift at all. We'll see if anybody else gets caught with their hand, not necessarily in the tin, but certainly placing a bet at Ladbrokes. And I'm sure we'll have a clearer indication of whether that is going to be a Labour supermajority or whether it's simply going to be Keir turning around an 80-seat majority, which Boris Johnson, of course, enjoyed last week. Come back and join us next week, and remember, for the next 7 days, don't do anything I wouldn't do.